Hello and welcome to session 2 on the QMed Academy podcast. And also we are going to publish it on or release it, it's called, on the YouTube channel.
Yeah.
So you are able to follow these sessions. Today we will talk about the user needs and the documentation that is required or helpful in the development of medical devices. Søren has joined me again for this session to be the knowledge expert, and I'm going to ask the questions. So, Søren.
Yes.
Let's continue this journey. We talked about the standalone documents in the session 1.
Yeah.
So let's continue here with, again, we can mention the device description again, or some of the other. Where would you start in defining the user need, and why is it so important?
Well, you need to know your user. It's regardless of whether it's a medical device or just a normal commercial product that you're selling, you need to know your user because they're in the end going to pay for it. It's a different story when we talk about devices because your commercialization is regulated to a very high degree sometimes. So that's something we're not going to touch upon and sort of go into further depths of market access, but it's understanding your user. When we talk about user needs, it's those that use your device. And it's super important because, physicians, they're very picky with their devices. And they tend to go with feelings sometimes as well. So that's also something you need to, incorporate in your device on however your device is. And in the previous episode, we use a case of a software. Well, for a software, you have a user interface. And how you're going to relay your information through this front end, as it would be called. So what is it that you're actually presenting to the user? Well, they might have some needs, that some specific things that they are actually looking at if they should use your device. So user needs is super important, not only to understand your user, but also in your design and your overall how you handle your device development. Because it should give input.
I've heard from or seen from some of the regulators that they often refer to that the use case is off, as they would say. They say it in a different way, but they say you put up something here which is not really the way you would normally use it. You are setting this up like something that's not usable during the daily setting. So they call it a use case. And we had that feedback a couple of times, especially from the FDA. They have a high, attention to that.
Yeah, and they definitely have, I think in their terms, they would call it protection of their patients. And that is very true. And we also see it in Europe, but it's a lot more subtle because you don't get feedback. So I think when we have seen the sort of same feedback where you don't actually fit into a use case is when we go for clinical studies, where when you create a clinical study protocol, you would design a study in a certain way, and not often, but you would get feedback sometimes if you haven't really looked at what is the use case of your device.
And if we look at what input sources you will have for this use case, it's not just you have a good idea, I put it into paper, and then,
and then
this is
boom,
going to be
then you have something
fantastic.
Yeah.
What is it that you are going to use as your input for the user need?
Yeah. I really enjoy literature. So all the clinical literature that can give you feedback and input. So as a case example, if you have a software assisting an endoscopic procedure, you need to know how an endoscopic procedure works. Get that from literature because you also need sources and references for it later on. Besides that, we are talking panels. That could be a panel of clinical experts. For this case, well, maybe abdominal surgeons would be a good user base. And not just only one. No. We've seen quite often where you have a clinical medical officer within the company, or it's actually funded from a clinical, but then it's only their perspective. And sometimes that's not enough, right? You actually also need to talk to those that don't like your device.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because quite often you find coherence in your input sources. So you would look for those that agree that your idea is a good idea. But the other way around, if you don't touch upon those that find your idea bad or your product not usable, well, then you don't know how to fix that sort of in your development. So it's really important to set the stage for creating your user needs, where, as you talk about input sources. I like literature because it's objective, but if you go for these panels and input sources being specialists of any kind, well, be sure that you are also objective, not just looking for those that agree with you.
And I think what I also learned over the years is that the regions are different. So we can make a use case here in Europe, and then we go to US and we realize that it doesn't work there.
Yeah.
It's a different setup.
Yeah.
It's controlled by other, parameters from outside. And they just work differently at the hospitals. And then all of a sudden you have a product that's not integratable into American hospitals. And you need to go back and change your user need.
Yeah.
And it can be for different regions, actually, that.
Yeah, exactly. And, well, even within Europe. And we also see it within Scandinavia, though it's a rather small market, right? If we just compare Germany to the whole of Scandinavia, it's a small market, but there are differences, and you need to be aware of that. And also of input sources, what you need to be aware of, there might be a difference between your user and sort of those that actually use it. Because you would have some devices, they have a reference where you have a certain medical professional teaching and learning a device because it's intended to be used by a lay user, so a normal person, right? So you would actually have two instances of users that you need to be aware of.
And I think what I also learned, I'm normally within clinical and not so much within development. But I learned when we are creating then based on the use case and the use scenarios, and we are going to put the user need together in a document, test them out. Try to imagine how actually to verify and validate these. And are you able to set up, we normally make this matrix and we start with, now I'm using my hands. This is when we start with the documents. The user needs. And then try to depict, what are the specific requirements that are applicable to the design of the device. How am I going to verify it? And can I actually validate it? Because all of a sudden, if you have some user needs that in the clinical setup, for instance, or the usability setup, all of a sudden you have some requirements or input that you're not able to actually, you have then to go back and you have to argue, why do I change the user need? It's something that you never, you rarely change. You don't want to go back and change that.
No.
So keep that matrix very close to you, and also that you know it by heart, because that will give that strength of different tests further on that you would need to do, and you can go back and really cross-reference.
Yeah, and I think it's one point too when we talk about user needs. It's also to to know that it's not your commercial strategy. So we are not, when we talk numbers and we're not talking
No.
in millions
No.
or sold value or no, that's not a need. That's a corporate need. What we are talking about, and what you also explained about this clinical impact in the end, is when you say something that is a user need, you need to further define that user needs. And we actually have that in the next session.
It's a teaser.
It is a teaser on requirement specifications, because for user needs, don't have too many. And when I say too many, we are talking maybe 5, 6, not more. Because each of them, if you go further and try to elaborate on it, you would see that one user need can be a requirement traceability of maybe 10, 12 other tests that you need to perform. So don't create, let's say, 50 user needs.
Nope.
And then you can just...
Then chop it up,
Yeah.
right? Wait, you have all this very nice material from all your inputs, your panels, your literature, your clinical guidelines, all the different places specifically for that treatment and that device, what's applicable.
Yeah.
And then pick the ones that will give you the best options moving forward, the shortest time and the most value, I would say. Because we see normally these long lists, right? This is a lot of wishes, but you will be very... It will be the chance of fulfilling this or succeeding, be successful, it's called, is actually minimal. So just be to the point. What's most important here?
Exactly. Sometimes the problem is in the end when we try to sort of go into depth with what it actually means is a lot of testing, a lot of clinical studies. So the more your wish list of user needs is created and it becomes bigger and bigger, well, expect in the end you also need to prove that, right? That's sort of the process here, is that everything you say needs to be proven.
Yeah. And would you, I know we talked about, and we also listed here some concept testing.
Yeah.
So really do early model testing or animal testing, maybe together with the panelist, your advisors.
Yeah.
Figure out where is the sweet spot for this product and document it.
Yeah.
If it's not documented, it didn't happen.
No, and it's the very important point here about concept testing is it cannot be clinical, because we are going to talk about that in an even further episode. But having if you now let's take the software, right? You can have a user go through the front end, so being the user interface, and they can say, well, I don't really like how the text is depicted over here. It would be easier if it's here, because when I sit, and so those input, you can use that in concept testing, but never in a patient, because then it's something different, and it's coming later. But initially, it could be a good thing to have this physical interaction when you get feedback.
And I think if we discuss just shortly the software, I know there is a lot of, or not a lot, but companies are buying data sets to test out their algorithm and the use of the algorithm, which is fine, but it doesn't replace clinical testing and clinical validation.
No.
And the data, if you're going to use it for a regulatory purpose, the new kind of guidance within software development is that this data needs to be developed and collected under the applicable standards and regulations.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of sets of clinical, how do you say that, output from some sessions that you can use, but it cannot be included in the final validation package.
No.
Needs to be separate.
There are definitely lots of examples there where the initial build of an algorithm is done on, free input. So for our case, it could be you find a web page or something else where there would be available videos from endoscopic procedures. That could be your input source for development. But besides that, as you say, everything that goes into your testing that we're going to talk about later, validation and clinical studies, you need approval to use that data.
And when would you actually update your user need?
I think if you do something like concept testing, or if you have a panel discussion, then it would be a very good time. Because, of course, initially you would go through what you have, right? But once you get user input, then you start to create your updates. So in the early stages, it would be rough. And then you go out and test your rough ideas.
You refine it.
Yeah, exactly. And then you refine it further on with your input. Yeah.
Very good. I would recommend locking the document, even though that you're going to go back and refresh it. It's much more tempting to just do smaller changes in the document and then you lose track.
Yeah.
So use your design control, lock the documents, and then go back, do a change, put in the change log what you actually did of changes and why you did it, and then release your new version. So
exactly.
But it's just because I'm the cleaner sometimes. I have to figure out what actually happened, and then you lose track.
Exactly.
Fantastic. That was about user need. Keep it simple. Keep track on the use case that you would like to fulfill. Go back and update it based on your concept, testings. Use the literature, other sources, advisors. And then we're actually ready for the next step. So thank you for this session.
You're welcome.